So a team of us at McLean went to London to learn this modality, and I'm going to try to explain it to you in 15 minutes. So as they do with mentalization-based treatments, we claim no innovation. This is not about being earth-shatteringly brilliant. It's really about trying to use resources that are available to us to provide the broadest support for families afflicted by BPD. As many people have already mentioned today, there are millions of families in the United States coping with BPD, and there aren't enough treatment resources. What multiple family groups do is provide a forum where one professional can see multiple families at the same time. And the emphasis is not the professional, not the experts, but rather that families can work with other families to understand, provide support, and work together in problem-solving common struggles. And I think as professionals, we often underestimate the value of this. So in our own professional family of experts treating BPD, we have our own instabilities and splits, and our formulations of BPD have at times been competitive between a theory of some kind of inborn, biologically driven sources of vulnerability, like impulsive aggression or affective instability, that combines with things that develop over time, like insecure attachment. And these things have an influence on what happens in families, where they struggle with the instability of interpersonal relationships with all these factors we know in terms of the symptoms of BPD. Now, it's true that these two sources of vulnerability towards BPD both contribute to the instability of relationships. And they also interact. So I think it's a false dichotomy to really say that BPD comes from one source or another. As some of our colleagues mentioned today, relationships are inherently affectively stimulating, and when there's affective instability, relationships are very difficult to manage. Now, major treatments for BPD tend to target these different sources of vulnerability in the disorder. MBT really tries to focus on the attachment instabilities in BPD, and really formulates the disorder as one where the instability of attachment, where people become preoccupied, confused, hostile, and helpless. That style contributes to create a lot of difficulty reflecting on what happens in relationships. And whether you have BPD in your family or not, when there are these events that happen for people who are traumatizing, whether they be sexual assaults, suicide attempts, or other very self-destructive situations, a family will have difficulty reflecting. So MBT wants to stabilize the functioning of the attachment and the process of mentalizing so that the family can actually sort out their own problems. DBT, as been mentioned, really focuses on helping people be more skillful, and in that competence can help stabilize the family dealing with some of these difficulties and challenges. And what can happen from these two approaches is increasing the stability of relationships. So they're not all modulated, realistic, secure, mutual, and balanced. I think that's a goal for all of us, but that they're more so through some of these interventions. But the problem is that these interventions are not very available. I think it's really wonderful, this growth of family connections. It's a grassroots effort, and I hope one day there's enough to go around to all the families affected by BPD. But there are other interventions that can be tried that are less specific to DBT treatments, including this multiple family therapy. So just a kind of summary of what can happen in families. I think this is really not driven by a specific treatment model, but one can see that this applies to many families where there's one family who has high emotion, and that high emotion gets in the way of being able to be reflective about oneself and others in relationships, which can drive efforts to control or change the self and others, whether they be self-destructive behaviors or interpersonally reactive behaviors. behaviors. And those controlling behaviors just generate more high emotion, and this affects the other family member. So of course, people want to intervene with family therapy, but there are some problems to family therapy approaches. One of them, I think, has been spoken to by our first set of panelists in this segment, is that family therapy intersects with the family in crisis and tends to focus on what's going wrong in the family. And this really tends to create an unintended and sometimes unconscious situation where there is a division between the family as the failed caretakers and the experts as the good caretakers. And this can oftentimes undermine the family support that the patient needs. And then even worse, that the families become somewhat demoralized and passive and reliant on therapists, and I've seen over time families become much more separated from their loved ones when their loved ones with BPD are most feeling isolated. And during these crisis-driven times, it's oftentimes hard for family members to really sustain stable mental representations of events. I think it's really entirely normal under that much duress to really have an ability to stably remember, recall, and talk about some of these stressful events, and that's what professionals tend to focus on. And there's a high reliance on talk with an unclear bridge to action. I think these skills-based approaches can help people actually solve problems, but some families really struggle to connect the things they learn with the high-intensity events that they have to manage. So that these families have difficulties breaking out of crises, problems, negative feelings, and become disempowered and demoralized. So what ends up happening, and this is a lesson that's really kind of common at the Anna Freud Center, where they're dealing with public services and the courts and families that are really struggling, there becomes a further disempowerment of these families and high reliance on multiple agencies. So this is where multiple family therapy was developed as an alternative. It's employed in schools, in legal situations, where there's a group that in itself, even if they're not doing mentalization-based therapy, allows for alternative perspectives. It allows families to watch similar problems in others. It diffuses the attachment system so that the family is not just dealing with their own problems, but oftentimes can think more clearly when they're watching the same problem evolve in a different family. And this allows people to kind of diffuse their affective intensity enough to actually facilitate mentalizing. So it's not just the MBT approach that facilitates mentalizing, it's actually a multiple family group environment that can facilitate the process of being able to be more reflective. And this is a therapy that really emphasizes activity more than talking. There's a focus on creativity and play to lighten the emotional tone. It really emphasizes flexibility, experimentation, and change, and promotes opportunities for positive engagement. So it's not just about having serious talks and high intensity worry focus, but allowing at times to actually have non-problem focused interactions. And then more difficult topics can be broached. And the focus is on the family to manage. This approach really decentralizes the therapists. And lastly, the families watch, help, coach, and cross-foster with other families. And this cross-fostering approach is extremely important, where parents can actually work with other children and show their own child that they can be effective under a lesser attachment activation, a lesser emotional tone, and that parents can vice versa see their children interact with other parents and do well with them. This generates a feeling of confidence and competence in all the people involved. So I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. It was just a video demonstration. So there are many benefits to this, including creating solidarity. There are some thoughts attached that people have said about this treatment, overcoming stigma and social isolation, stimulating new perspectives by allowing families to have different angles on the problem and experience it from different positions. Families learn from each other, they see themselves in others, and they experience positive peer pressure. When they're asked to interact around a problem in front of a group, they're forced to engage rather than remain passive and disengage. And this allows for mutual support and feedback without involving the clinician. And so this is an approach that really focuses on helping families develop competencies and work with each other to manage their shared problems. So within the context of these activities, we really encourage families to help each other try different things so that they change the outcome. And this can raise hopes and an opportunity to practice these new behaviors in a safe space. And this is the way that mentalization is actually strengthened, without a lot of kind of focused, specialized therapy, but through this group activity. So what the therapist does is just create a context to allow the families to manage their own problems. They identify the problems and they track like a diary card the targets so that the families can see their progress over time. And one of the important things about this model, like Family Connections, is to have the more experienced families co-lead so that they can be examples of hope for just starting families. So what I was going to show in the video that I'm just going to skip in the interest of time is that part of how you start MFT is to do icebreakers. Now, this is something that might bring up dread. It's the concept of speed dating. And I thought that was dreadful enough, but I learned a more dreadful version here, speed dating. That's our postdoc for next year who did a great job with it. So one of the ways we do this is we actually have families configured in an inner circle and an outer circle where they interview each other for very brief periods of time, less than 5 minutes, if you can believe it, about light topics to start, like what did you do last night, to more serious problems, what brought you here. And the mentalizing process occurs when you actually come back as a big group and think about what you've learned about each other, what problems people share. So you generate a process of mentalizing by helping the group interact. And it gives a sense of shared problems and things that people have in common. Now, when the group bonds over these situations, more daring activities are taken on. So MFT really encourages exposure to the problem behaviors. So with eating disorders, they encourage groups of families to eat meals together to see how the problems evolve and how the families manage the problems. Going to the store, that's actually a point of high stress for me when you're with children. So seeing how people actually manage, and especially when you have patients with borderline personality disorder with their own children, it's oftentimes more helpful to be in the scenario with them, to help them think about what they're doing, observe it, watch it back on videotape, than to talk about it in a mental representation format. And what the therapist does is just these 5 steps. They observe the interaction saying, I noticed that. For example, when you start raising your voice, she stops listening. Or in your family, everyone talks at the same time. And then you enlist the family in evaluating it. Is this the way you see it? Is this an issue for you? And are you happy with the way it is? Because the family has to decide that, not the professional. And then the 4th step is towards change, asking the family, if you wish to change, what is it that you want to have happen? And lastly, what steps do you have to make it that way? So this is really focusing on helping the family decide how they're going to manage the problem and help them reflect on how to do that. So the goals of this approach is to be relaxed and flexible, playful and humorous, give tasks and activities, not talking, about the problem solving and generating opportunities for different perspectives, and conveying that the family has ownership of the problem, not the treaters. And this is an opportunity for the families to enact change in a safe space. So possibilities for this already exist with some of the family organizations like NEA BPD and Terra for BPD, and Family Connections is a great start, but the MFT approach would just incorporate more shared activities together. So thank you.